So let's expand this simple song we've created. Now, we've developed this digitally, so there is a certain level of syntheticness to it. It feels a little fake. How might we imitate the real world? Well, when you hear sound in the real world, you're going to hear it within the context of the space that that sound exists. If you hear a sound in a cathedral, it's going to be more echoey. It's going to sustain much more than if you were in a small padded room like this studio that I'm in right now. Everything is muted and clean. There's no reverberation. So that brings us to our next effect after EQ, reverb. Reverb imitates the space that a sound is played or made in. So we can get that cathedral effect, or we can get a small room effect, or we could get a bathroom effect. Sounds sound differently based on the architecture or lack thereof. So we could apply reverb to every individual track, but if we did that, it wouldn't sound quite like it would sound in the context of a trio playing music in the same environment. That trio would be sharing the same reverb. And so if we apply reverb to tracks individually, it's going to start getting muddy. There's going to be a lot more signal processing, which will slow down our program theoretically. But it will also fuse the frequencies in weird ways and make things feel not quite right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a bus. We are going to route the audio signals out of each of our tracks into one shared signal. And then we're going to process that signal with some reverb. So first I'm just going to group my 3 tracks together by creating a new track and then clicking on my high track and shift clicking all the way to my low track and then dragging that underneath that new track. And so you'll see this thick blue line appear, and I want that line to be sort of indented, and that is going to place those tracks in a group. And I'll just title that grouped EQ. And then I'm going to create another new track, and this will be our reverb, so I will label it that. Click on my effects button and search for reverb. Except I'm going to search REAVERB. And make sure that you have all plugins selected, otherwise it may limit your search. So I'm going to select reverberate, rather than reverb. Reverb is a bit simple, so reverberate can give us more options. If you're on a Mac, you may want to select matrix reverb. That is a nice built-in reverb that Macs have. And so that pulls up our reverb effect window here. And so you'll notice a few different parameters here, which are fairly intuitive. Room size, so do we want a larger or smaller room? Dampening, how much an effect will start muting out over time. Stereo width, how much the effect pans left and right. You can make a space sound more narrow or wider. Initial delay, how long it takes that sound to ramp in to its full signal. And then low pass and high pass. So like our EQ, we can filter out low or high frequencies based on this. But before we start tweaking these, I want to point your attention to our wet and our dry sliders here. So wet and dry are terms used in effects mixing. So we have our dry signal, that's our original signal with no effect applied. And then we have our wet signal, that original signal, but with those effects on it. And so if we mute out our dry signal here, then this reverb track is only going to have that wet signal. It's only going to have that reverb applied. Now, this track doesn't have any signal right now because we haven't yet routed our original tracks to it. And we can do that very simply by clicking and dragging on this route button from each individual track over to our reverb tracks. And so if I click and drag from this route button onto my reverb track, you're going to see a quarter-inch jack icon appear, and that is indicating that you are routing your signal or wiring as you would do it in an analog context into this track. And so you'll now notice that there is a blue circle highlighted on that track I've just routed and a yellow circle of my reverb route button. And that means that this is receiving a signal and this track is sending a signal. And it's also pulled up this little routing menu to indicate how much of that signal we're sending. So you can tell it how much volume from the signal we're sending to our reverb track. I don't just have to click and drag. That's just a fast way of doing it. I can also just click on that route button and it pulls up this route window. And in this route window, you'll see on the left side, we have sends. So we are sending our signal to another track. And then we also have receives. So our reverb track will be receiving that signal. So if I send, since I'm on my mid track here, I can send that to my reverb track. And this is why it's very good to label your tracks so that you know if you're routing tracks that they are going to the right one. So when I click this, we now have that send volume interface. And if I open up the route window on my reverb track, it's going to pull up that now my mid signals are being received. And so just to demonstrate, if I want to, instead of sending from the low track to the reverb track, I can do it from my reverb track as a receive. So I'm going to select add new receive and select low. And now all three of these tracks are routing to my reverb track. So this can be known as a reverb bus. We are sending our tracks to then be processed as one, and that effect will now be applied to the three tracks simultaneously. So we've approached this three different ways just for demonstration. That is by clicking and dragging from the route button to the receive track, by selecting a send from the track we are trying to send, or by receiving a signal from another track in our reverb. And so if I now solo this reverb track, you will only hear the wet reverb signal with whatever parameters are applied here. So we're not hearing any of the dry signals. We're only hearing that affected signal. And if you're just starting out, you may not even want to fiddle with these parameters. You'll get to know them over time, moving them based on your taste, but you can always start with a preset if the effect is offering that. Most of the presets in Reverberate here are targeted towards drums, which can have interesting effects even if you're not using drums. But if we wanted, for example, an expansive sound, you might find a preset like Dark Corridor. So this will sound echoey, I'm assuming, and very large. Take that dry back down. So this is a very large sounding reverb. That's because our room size is set to be very big. Our stereo width is at its max. Things feel far left and right. There's a little bit of dampening, so the notes don't linger as much. They get muted out quicker. So with a high dampening, notes end a little faster. They have less sustain. With less dampening, things are not being muted as much. They linger more. There's more sustain. And initial delay is sort of the opposite of dampening. It is gradually leading into the note. So if I make this even longer, we're going to end up with more smeared sounding notes. And then, of course, I can play around with the low and high pass to cut out or amplify certain low and high frequencies. And I'll just reset back to Dark Corridor. And I'll just note here that you can see that I'm peaking. This has highlighted red, so I'm just going to bring that volume down. Otherwise, my entire song will be distorted. And so now if I unsolo this, we're going to bring back that dry signal and hear it as if we are hearing both the original signal and this reverberated signal, as if we are in that dark corridor. Completely dry and with signal. And you can hear when I stop that track, it carries on because that effect is still processing that original signal. I'm actually going to bring my reverb all the way back up by double-clicking on the volume here, and then I'm going to shift-click onto all of my tracks and just bring the volume down on all of them. Just so we're giving ourselves a little padding to make sure that we're not peaking anywhere. So that's an example of routing where we want to send multiple tracks to one effect so that it's cohesive. But what if I want just one effect applied to just one track to play around with it in interesting ways? I can apply that effect directly to the track. So let's explore delay on our high track. And so I'm going to click the effects button on my high frequency track. And then I'm going to hit add. And I'm going to look up delay. And there are different types of delay. Reaper has a bunch of different ones built in. Rather than selecting sort of the default, I'm going to make things a little more interesting by selecting delay with tempo ping pong. So this is a special type of delay, and a lot of people might think of delay as an echo. You're repeating a sound over and over again and having it gradually fade out as if that signal was bouncing off the walls until it eventually just dies out. But with a tempo-based delay, that delay will sync to the tempo, which can lead to a lot of interesting rhythms layered on top of your original rhythms, depending on the time you set that delay to. And on top of that, we're doing a ping pong, and ping pong is a stereo effect where you're sending a signal back and forth to the left and right speakers. So you're going to hear this delay bounce back and forth as if it is a ping pong ball traveling from either side of a ping pong table. So just to highlight things, I'm going to solo my high frequency track and play this. And so you can hear that signal is continuing, but as it continues, it starts to fade out. This adds more rhythm. It thickens up our sound and also creates much more dynamic rhythms within our piece as a whole. I can increase the amount of times it repeats by increasing the feedback. You never really want to go above 0 because then it will keep growing that signal, and instead of dying out, it will start increasing in amplitude and eventually hurt your ears. So I'm going to make sure that I'm at -1, and that will increase the amount of times that it repeats, but it will still fade out gradually. So we have a lot more repeats than that default we started with. Here, I'm not going to change the wet or dry because I still want my original signal, unlike in that bust track. But I can take a look here at the delay time, and you'll notice that here it says tempo synced, so it's going to line up with our tempo based on whatever BPM we have here. But if I lengthen this delay, we're going to lengthen the amount of time it takes to start repeating that signal. And that will inevitably just make things sound more expansive, less thick the longer the delay is. And depending on how things are overlapping, you're going to end up with different types of harmonies. Bring that back down. If I do a tighter delay, it's going to condense everything and make things sound thicker. We've also got this tempo sync option, which will tell it how to sync it to the beats per minute based on notes. So if I tighten this up, those repeats are a lot tighter, they're synced a lot closer together, and you get that tight repeat that almost feels like waking up from a dream or something. And so by increasing that tempo sync, we're kind of changing the phase at which these notes repeat, and things start to overlap in interesting ways, maybe harmonize, as long as you're sticking to a scale. And to really round this out and make things super interesting, I'm going to widen my ping pong. So right now everything's echoing on the center, but now I can make it echo between the left and right speakers. Bring that all the way up to max. So you can hear this creates some interesting textures, creates more dynamic effects, and makes your overall track more interesting. Could be more confusing if you really blow out. I could add multiple delays, so if I just copy and paste this, we're gonna get real crazy once I start adjusting the timing. Things will become much more ambient. We're playing with a lot more rhythms. And each effect is affecting the previous one. So I'll stop that. I don't want to get too crazy. Delete those. And that's delay, a specific type of delay, a tempo synced ping pong delay. And so now let's hear this with the other tracks in play. Very beautiful, if I do say so myself. So delay's very fun. What if I want to add a little more grit? What if I want to make things feel a little more powerful? What we could do is add some distortion. So I'd like to do that on my low track. So I'm going to click on my FX button here, and I'm going to go to add and look up distort. So let's add fuzz, make things feel fuzzy. So this is going to kind of mangle our original signal, and distortion is, commonly if you're trying to make a nice clean track where everything can be understood if someone's speaking, distortion is not what you want. It can hurt your ears, it can make things a little more confusing. But when applied to instruments or even vocals, it can make things a little punchier, a little more gritty, which may be conveying a feeling that you couldn't convey with just a clean signal. And so what digital distortion does is it almost pixelates your sound. It takes that original track and broadens each individual sample within that track, almost as if you're widening every pixel and making them overlap to create more and more chaos. So let's solo this. And you can hear that's gotten a little grittier. If I change the shape, you're going to hear that distortion change in a bit of a different way. And right now this is the left channel, so I'm going to actually put it in stereo. So hard limit increases not only the volume, but also the threshold at which it's distorting. And since that has gotten louder, I'm going to lower the volume of the overall track. So it adds a little more oomph, a little more crunch. Feels grittier. But what if I want to really amplify those lows? Let's repitch this in addition to distorting it. And here I'm going to touch on this idea of effects chain. So the order in which you apply effects is going to change how those effects are processed. If I put my distortion at the end, it will distort what is already EQ'd. But if I put my distortion before that EQ, it's going to sound a little different because it is playing with all of the frequency range before we apply that EQ. So to better illustrate this concept, I'm going to bring in a repitcher by hitting add and say REA pitch. And so I like that original tone, the original octave. So I want to hear layer an octave below on top of my original octave. So I want to maintain that original dry signal. So I'm going to double click this and that's going to bring it back up to 0 to my baseline level. And then here you've got a range of options. You can shift the pitch by a full range, by sense, by little parts that are just slightly detuned but not changing the note completely, by semitones, which will change the note, and then by octaves, lowering it or raising it by 12 notes or 24 or any multiple of 12. Down here we have formant shifts, which is a whole different topic, so I won't touch on it right now. So I'm just going to lower my octave here. And so now we've got a little more body there. Let's see how it sounds down 2 octaves. Sounds bigger, a little more intimidating. But as I was mentioning before, the order in which we apply these effects will change how it sounds. So if I pitch it down before I distort it, we're going to get a little more of that grittiness applied to that lower octave. So I'm going to move this as it's playing and you'll hear the difference. So as you can see, I moved it in front of both the EQ and distortion, and it sounded different depending on that order. So if it's before the EQ, we are filtering out any higher frequencies that repitch might end up creating with that layer of that lower octave. But with it after the EQ and after the distortion, we're going to have that distorted signal, and that distorted signal is going to have some higher frequencies, which repitch will also play around with. So a lot more high-pitched frequencies will be brought through. Even though we eliminated lower pitches, that distortion is bringing in different resonant frequencies that are higher pitched. Because I'm trying to make this stand out over the other tracks, since we're focusing on the lows here, I'm going to keep it before. It may even sound different if I bring my EQ after the distortion. Let's see. Gets even more bassy because any sort of high resonant frequencies that the distortion creates is now eliminated by my EQ. And I really want those high-pitched frequencies to stand out, so I'm going to make sure my EQ is happening at the end.